Combat boots are thundering right overhead. Below, in the cold engine room of a ghost ship, veteran Jack Sullivan and his dog Leo have only seconds left. His hand trembles on the keypad, trying to open a 40-year-old secret vault, a place that holds a father's legacy and a discovery that could change the world. But the traitor from the past is closing in, and he is willing to kill to ensure this secret never sees the light of day. The door hisses and slides open at the exact moment armed figures storm in. They found the truth, but will they survive to tell it? Please support us by subscribing to the channel. The relentless drizzle of a Portland, Maine autumn mirrored the perpetual dampness in Jack Sullivan's soul. It was early October 2023, and the chill that seeped into his bones felt less like weather and more like a permanent resident. His small rented apartment on the outskirts of the working harbor district offered little warmth, either literally or figuratively. Every surface was a testament to his unraveling life. Stacks of unpaid bills, a worn-out armchair bought years ago at a yard sale, and the faint, persistent smell of stale coffee. Jack Sullivan was a man carved from hardship, now whittled down to a brittle edge. At 45, his face was a map of etched lines, not from laughter, but from the relentless grind of combat and subsequent peace that felt anything but peaceful. His eyes, once sharp and commanding, now held a haunted, distant look, often fixed on something only he could see. He was a U.S. Army veteran, having served 2 tours in Afghanistan, leaving behind a piece of himself in the unforgiving deserts. The PTSD was a constant companion, a silent specter that shadowed his days and plagued his nights. After returning home, he'd built a small construction company, pouring his savings, his sweat, and his remaining hope into it. For a while, it thrived. He married a kind woman, bought a small house, and dared to dream of a normal life. But the echoes of war proved louder than any joy, and the financial crisis of the early 2022, coupled with his own internal battles, had slowly, agonizingly consumed everything. The divorce was bitter, leaving him with little more than shattered pride and crippling debt. His company, once a source of pride, had declared bankruptcy 6 months prior, taking his last shred of financial stability with it. His sole anchor in this storm was Leo, a magnificent German shepherd with a coat of striking silver gray mottled with patches of white around his chest and muzzle. Leo was 6 years old, a former military working dog, MWD, who had served alongside Jack in his second tour. Their bond was forged in the crucible of danger, a silent pact of loyalty and understanding that transcended words. After Jack's honorable discharge, he'd fought tooth and nail to adopt Leo, rescuing him from the cold anonymity of a kennel. Leo's temperament was a peculiar blend of fierce protectiveness and gentle devotion. He moved with a quiet dignity, his large, intelligent brown eyes constantly tracking Jack, an unspoken question in their depths. Now, Leo lay curled at Jack's feet, his head resting on his paws, occasionally letting out a soft sigh that seemed to resonate with Jack's own despair. Jack ran a hand through his thinning brown hair, a gesture of weary resignation. He stared at the stack of envelopes on his kitchen table, each one a fresh reminder of his failures. The gas bill, the overdue rent notice, a final demand from the bank. His savings account was a phantom, and his last construction job had ended weeks ago. He was down to his last few $100s, barely enough to cover Leo's special veterinary food and a few more days of ramen noodles for himself. "What are we going to do, boy?" Jack murmured, more to himself than to Leo. Leo's ears twitched, and he nudged Jack's hand with his wet nose, a soft whine escaping his throat. Jack sighed, pushing the bills aside. His gaze fell upon a crumpled newspaper, several days old, lying discarded on the floor. He picked it up, not expecting anything, just needing a distraction. His eyes scanned the classifieds, skipping over help-wanted ads that required experience he no longer had, or a stability he lacked. Then, a small, unassuming notice, almost hidden between an ad for a used fishing boat and a plea for donations to a local animal shelter, caught his eye. Abandoned vessel, the Sea Serpent, Free to qualified applicant willing to assume towing and disposal costs. Contact Portland Harbor Authority. Jack read it again, and then a third time. Free. The word hung in the air, a siren song against the backdrop of his mounting debts. A cargo ship. Abandoned for years, no doubt a rusting hulk, a monument to forgotten dreams. But free. It meant potential, however small. Scrap metal. Even a fraction of what it might be worth could buy them time. A reprieve from the precipice he was teetering on. His mind, usually clouded by anxieties, began to work, calculating. The cost of towing. The fees for disposal. It would surely eat into his meager funds, perhaps all of them. But what other option did he have? Starvation? Homelessness? He couldn't let that happen, not with Leo depending on him. The sheer audacity of it, a crazy, desperate gamble, appealed to the soldier in him who had always known how to fight when cornered. Leo, sensing the shift in Jack's mood, lifted his head, his intelligent eyes fixed on his human. He let out a soft woof, a question and a challenge wrapped into one. "You're right, boy," Jack said, a grim smile touching his lips. "It's insane. But what do we have to lose?" He picked up the phone, his fingers hovering over the numbers for the Portland Harbor Authority. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about finding one last shred of purpose, one last fight against the overwhelming tide of despair. It was for Leo. The following morning, a thin, gray light struggled to break through the persistent cloud cover. A salty wind whipped off the Atlantic, carrying the cries of gulls and the low groan of distant foghorns. Jack parked his old rust-pocked truck at the far end of the harbor, the engine sputtering its final complaint before falling silent. Leo sat in the passenger seat, his posture alert, his head cocked as he stared out at the forest of masts and cranes. They walked towards the most neglected part of the port, a place where forgotten vessels came to die. And there she was. The sea serpent rose from the murky water like the skeletal remains of some ancient leviathan. She was larger than Jack had anticipated, a hulking mass of oxidized metal, her hull streaked with long, weeping trails of rust that looked like bloody tears. Her paint, once likely a proud blue, had surrendered to decades of salt and sun, leaving a mottled, corpse-like palette of brown and orange. Her superstructure was a maze of sharp, decaying angles against the bleak sky. She was a ghost ship in every sense of the word. "Well, boy," Jack said, his voice nearly lost in the wind, "there's our grand prize." Leo whined softly, pressing close to Jack's leg. He wasn't scared, but a palpable sense of caution emanated from him. A rickety gangway, its wooden planks slick with algae and rot, offered the only path aboard. Jack tested it with his boot, and it groaned in protest, but held. He carried a heavy canvas bag with a few essential tools, a hammer, a wrench, and a sturdy crowbar. He took the first step, then another, his boots making squelching sounds on the damp wood. Leo followed close behind, his paws moving with a silent, deliberate grace that belied the treacherous footing. Stepping onto the main deck felt like entering a tomb. The air was thick with the smell of decay, of wet metal, and of a deep, profound loneliness. A silence hung over the ship that was more than just an absence of sound. It was a heavy, oppressive presence. Debris littered the deck, a scattering of rotted ropes, broken crates, and the lonely shape of a seabird's skeleton. While Leo began a cautious, sniffing exploration of the perimeter, Jack set to work. His construction background took over, his eyes scanning not the decay, but the bones beneath. He stomped on the steel deck plates, listening for the ring of solid metal versus the dull thud of rusted-out sections. He ran his calloused hands along the railings and examined the welds on the cargo hatches. The surface decay was severe, but the ship's core structure seemed surprisingly sound. She was built to last, a product of an era when things were made of sterner stuff. There was potential here, maybe not a fortune, but enough to get back on his feet. He was so absorbed in his assessment that at first he didn't notice the change in Leo. His loyal companion had stopped his methodical patrol. He was standing stock still in the middle of a long, enclosed corridor that ran alongside the main cargo hold, his ears erect, his nose twitching as he tasted the air. Jack watched him for a moment. Leo's entire body was tense, a coiled spring of focused energy. "What is it, Leo? Smell a rat?" Jack called out. Leo ignored him. He took a few slow, deliberate steps forward, his nose low to the ground. He stopped in front of a section of the steel bulkhead, a flat, featureless wall of painted metal. He began sniffing intently at a tiny, almost invisible seam where two plates had been joined. A low whine started deep in his chest. It was a sound Jack knew well, the sound Leo made when he was onto something, when his instincts were screaming at him. Jack walked over, his boots echoing in the corridor. "It's just a wall, boy." Leo looked up at him, his intelligent brown eyes filled with an urgent plea, and then went back to the wall. This time, he began to scratch at the metal, his claws making a sharp, scraping sound. The whine grew louder, more insistent, before erupting into a single, sharp bark that shattered the ship's silence. Jack knelt, running his hand over the spot. The metal was cold and solid. He couldn't see or smell anything out of the ordinary. But he trusted Leo more than he trusted his own senses. The dog's instincts had saved their lives more than once in the dust and chaos of a war zone. If Leo was adamant about this spot, there was a reason. Okay, I get it," Jack said, ruffling the thick fur on Leo's neck. "Let's see what you're so worked up about." He retrieved the heavy crowbar from his tool bag. Finding purchase in the tiny seam, he put his weight into it. The metal groaned. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he strained, the muscles in his back and arms screaming in protest. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a loud wrenching screech of tortured metal, the panel buckled. It wasn't just a wall panel. It was a door, crudely welded shut and painted over to conceal its existence. He worked the crowbar back and forth, widening the gap. The air that escaped from within was stale and musty, an ancient breath held for decades. It was the smell of old paper and treated canvas, the scent Leo's sensitive nose must have detected through the corroded seam. With one final heave, the panel tore free from its rusted frame and clanged onto the deck. Jack shone his small flashlight into the dark cavity beyond. It was a small, hidden compartment, barely large enough for a man to crawl inside, and resting on a small shelf within was a single object, a thick, leather-bound book carefully wrapped in a sheath of dark, oiled canvas. Jack reached in, his heart pounding a nervous rhythm against his ribs. He pulled the object out into the dim light of the corridor. He unwrapped the oilcloth, its surface still slick after all these years. It was a ship's logbook. He ran his thumb over the faded gold lettering embossed on the worn leather cover. The last entry date was clearly visible, 1985. Back in the stale air of his apartment, Jack sat at his small kitchen table, the ancient logbook open before him. The world outside, with its drizzling rain and gray skies, seemed to fade away. Leo lay under the table, his head resting on Jack's boot, a warm, reassuring weight in a world that had suddenly become untethered. For hours, Jack read, his fingers tracing the elegant, spidry-looping script of a man long dead. The logbook began with the mundane details of a cargo run, weather patterns, engine performance, crew assignments. But as the entries for October 1985 progressed, the captain's tone began to shift. A palpable sense of anxiety bled through the ink. He wrote of a last-minute change in their manifest, of picking up a single, unnamed passenger in a clandestine meeting at sea. He described the passenger as a quiet, nervous man with haunted eyes who never left his cabin. Then came the entries about the special cargo, which was kept under constant guard in a specially reinforced hold. The captain was never told what it was, only that it was of vital importance to national security. The final entries, dated in late October, were nearly illegible, the handwriting frantic and spidery. He wrote of being followed, of seeing a shadow on the radar that would vanish whenever they tried to confirm its position. The last sentence was an unfinished scrawl. "They know he is on board. May God have mercy on our—" The words ended there. Jack closed the book, the silence in the room pressing in on him. This was more than just an old ship's log. It was a testament, a final, desperate message from a man who had sailed into oblivion. He was a veteran, trained to recognize the signs of a covert operation gone wrong. He knew he was holding something dangerous, a secret that had been submerged for nearly 40 years, and he knew he was completely out of his depth. The next day, Jack found himself standing outside the brick and ivy walls of the University of Southern Maine's History Department. He had called ahead, asking to speak with someone who specialized in maritime history, and had been given the name Dr. Eris Thorne. He left Leo patiently waiting in the truck, the window cracked to let in the crisp autumn air. Dr. Thorne's office was a small, cluttered space that smelled wonderfully of old books and brewing tea. Books were stacked on every available surface, threatening to avalanche onto a desk covered in nautical charts and half-finished manuscripts. Dr. Eris Thorne herself was a woman in her late 50s, with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Her silvering hair was pulled back in a messy but practical bun, and she wore a simple wool sweater and spectacles perched on the end of her nose. Her demeanor was brisk and academic, but her eyes held a spark of genuine curiosity. "Mr. Sullivan," she said, gesturing to a chair nearly buried in books. "Your call was rather intriguing. You said you found a logbook?" Jack nodded, carefully unwrapping the oilcloth and placing the book on the only clear space on her desk. "On a ship I recently acquired, the Sea Serpent. The last entry is from 1985. Dr. Thorne's eyebrows shot up. She handled the book with the reverence of a true historian, her fingers gently tracing the cover. "The Sea Serpent," she murmured, a flicker of recognition in her eyes. "That vessel has a complicated history, most of it rumor, of course. She's been a ghost in the harbor for as long as I can remember." She spent several minutes examining the logbook, her expression growing more and more focused. "This is an incredible find, Mr. Sullivan. Authentic, by the looks of it." She looked up at him over the rim of her glasses. "You are right to think this is significant, but a logbook on its own is just a story. To verify it, you need context." She tapped a long finger on the desk. "My advice? Go to the city's public library archives. Look through the newspapers from late 1985, say October through December. Search for any maritime anomalies, any reports of missing ships or unusual events at sea off the coast of Maine. If this story is real, it will have left a ripple somewhere." Following her advice, Jack spent the next several hours in the hushed, dusty basement of the Portland Public Library. He sat at a clunky microfilm reader, the whirring of the machine a hypnotic sound as he scrolled through endless pages of old news. The hours bled together in a blur of grainy black and white images. He saw articles about local politics, fishing quotas, and high school football games. He felt his hope beginning to wane, the search feeling more and more like a fool's errand. Just as he was about to give up, a small headline on an inside page from a November 1985 edition caught his eye. "Ghost ship found adrift off Maine coast." His heart leaped. The article was short. It detailed how a Coast Guard cutter had discovered the cargo ship Sea Serpent drifting in international waters, completely deserted. There was no sign of the crew, no distress call, and no clue as to what had happened. The ship was eventually towed to Portland, where it had remained ever since, an unsolved local mystery. With trembling hands, Jack printed a copy of the article. He drove back to the university, his mind racing. The story was real. He found Dr. Thorne preparing to leave for the day. He spread the newspaper clipping on her desk next to the logbook. "You were right," he said, his voice breathless. She read the article, her expression unreadable. Then she walked to a large filing cabinet in the corner of her office, unlocked it, and pulled out a thin, unmarked folder. She laid it on the desk. "I always suspected there was a connection," she said quietly. "Now you've provided the missing piece." She opened the folder. Inside were several heavily redacted government documents and a photograph of a serious-looking man with dark, intelligent eyes. "When you mentioned the ship and the year, it triggered a memory of a file I was allowed to view once for a research paper on Cold War naval operations. It involved the disappearance of a brilliant Eastern Bloc scientist, a man who was attempting to defect to the United States." She slid the photograph across the desk. His name was Victor Orlov. The new knowledge settled heavily in Jack's gut. Victor Orlov, a man, not a ghost, had walked these decks. A scientist carrying a secret so vast that it had cost him his life and erased his crew from existence. The Sea Serpent was no longer just a heap of rusting metal. It was a memorial, a floating tombstone that held a story only Jack now knew existed. His initial plan to sell the ship for scrap felt like a betrayal, a desecration of a silent promise. For the next few days, Jack and Leo returned to the ship with a new sense of purpose. The work was still grueling, driven by the practical need to clear away decades of filth and decay, but now every action was infused with a sense of reverence. He was not just clearing debris. He was searching for clues, for anything Orlov or the captain might have left behind. They focused their efforts on the superstructure, working their way down from the bridge. The galley, or the ship's kitchen, was a time capsule of neglect. Rusted pots and pans were still hanging on their hooks, and a thick layer of grime covered every surface. The air was heavy with the smell of rust and stale grease. While Jack worked, prying open jammed cabinets and sorting through salvageable fixtures, Leo conducted his own, more thorough, investigation. The German shepherd, usually calm and composed, seemed particularly agitated in this space. He paced back and forth across the checkered linoleum floor, his claws clicking softly in the quiet. His nose was constantly working, sniffing at the base of the rusted-out stove and along the edges of the floorboards. Jack assumed he was simply tracking the scent of the ship's long-dead inhabitants. Then, Leo's behavior zeroed in on one specific area. Near a corner, where a section of the floor had buckled slightly with age, he began to whine. It was a low, insistent sound. He pawed at the edge of a loose floorboard, then looked back at Jack, his ears flattened, his eyes pleading. "It's just the floor, boy," Jack said, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a dirty glove. "Probably just some old water damage." Leo was not convinced. He let out a sharp bark and began scratching more forcefully, his powerful paws tearing away a chunk of the rotting linoleum. He was clearly agitated by something beneath the floor. Jack sighed. Experience had taught him that ignoring Leo's instincts was a fool's game. All right, let's see what's got you so riled up," he said, grabbing his crowbar. He wedged the tip of the tool under the loose floorboard and pried it up with a groan of protesting wood and rusted nails. The space beneath was dark and filled with a foul, musty odor. As Jack shone his flashlight into the cavity, he saw the source of Leo's fixation, a large, messy rat's nest. It was a chaotic jumble of shredded cloth, old bits of paper, and other debris the rodents had scavenged over the years. "See? Just a rat's nest," Jack said, partly relieved. But Leo was still whining, nudging his nose toward the center of the grimy pile. Jack poked at the nest with the end of his crowbar, and something inside glinted, catching the beam of his flashlight. It was a small metallic object, dark with tarnish. Curious, he reached in with his gloved hand and pulled it out. It was heavy, far heavier than it looked. As he wiped away the grime, the rich, warm glow of old brass emerged. It was a key, but unlike any key Jack had ever seen. It was ornate and beautifully crafted, its shaft covered in intricate engravings that resembled scientific formulas or complex circuits. The head of the key was not a simple loop, but was shaped into a heavy, circular seal depicting a stylized atom. It was a work of art, something that belonged in a museum, not in a rat's nest on a derelict cargo ship. He knew with a chilling certainty that this was connected to Viktor Orlov. He held it in the palm of his hand, the cold, heavy brass, a tangible link to the ship's violent past. Leo nudged his hand, licking his fingers as if to say, "I told you so." As dusk began to settle, casting long, menacing shadows across the harbor, Jack packed up their tools. He slipped the brass key into the secure pocket of his jacket, its weight a constant, pressing reminder of the deepening mystery. He and Leo made their way down the gangway, both of them tired and covered in grime. As they walked toward his truck in the near-empty parking lot, a flicker of movement caught Jack's eye. It was a reflexive scan of his surroundings, a habit drilled into him by years of service in hostile territory. You always checked your six. You always looked for what was out of place. And something was definitely out of place. A black sedan was parked at the edge of the lot, its engine off, its windows tinted so dark they looked like voids. It hadn't been there when they arrived that morning. Portland was a working harbor, and the vehicles here were trucks, vans, and weather-beaten station wagons. A pristine, anonymous sedan, like this one, stuck out like a sore thumb. Jack slowed his pace, not wanting to seem alarmed, his hand instinctively dropping to rest on Leo's head. The dog sensed his owner's tension immediately, and a low, almost inaudible growl rumbled in his chest. Jack felt a cold dread creep up his spine. The car was positioned perfectly to offer a clear, unobstructed view of the sea serpent and anyone coming or going from it. He couldn't see who was inside, but he could feel their eyes on him. He felt the unnerving sensation of being a target in someone's sights. He didn't look back as he reached his truck, but he was acutely aware of the sedan remaining motionless, a silent, predatory presence in the growing darkness. This wasn't a historical mystery anymore. He was not alone in his search for the truth, and whoever was in that car was not a fellow historian. He was being watched. The night was long. Jack barely slept, his mind replaying the image of the black sedan, a dark specter in the corner of his eye. Every creak of the old apartment building, every distant siren, sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. He was back in a war zone, but this one was silent, fought in the shadows of a city that was supposed to be his home. The brass key sat on his kitchen table, its intricate design seeming to mock him in the dim light. Leo stayed glued to his side all night, a warm, living shield against the encroaching darkness. His quiet presence the only thing that kept Jack's spiraling thoughts in check. He decided against returning to the ship the next day. It was too exposed, too obvious. Instead, he and Leo took a long, circuitous walk through a nearby park, Jack constantly scanning the streets and faces around them, looking for anything out of place. He felt the familiar weight of hypervigilance, a heavy cloak he thought he had shed years ago. They returned to the apartment in the late afternoon. As Jack unlocked his door, Leo, who was a step ahead of him, suddenly froze in the doorway. The fur on his neck bristled, and a low, menacing growl rumbled deep in his chest. Jack's hand immediately went for the heavy maglite he kept by the door, his body tensing for a confrontation. "Easy, boy," he whispered. A man was sitting in the worn-out armchair in the corner of his living room, as if he had been waiting there for hours. He hadn't broken in. The lock was untouched. He had simply let himself in, a feat that spoke of a skill set far beyond that of a common burglar. The man was older, likely in his early 70s, with a face that was a roadmap of a hard-lived life. His frame was lean but wiry, and he sat with a ramrod-straight posture that bespoke a lifetime of discipline. His short gray hair was neatly combed, and his eyes, a piercing shade of blue, were sharp, intelligent, and missed nothing. They held no malice, only a deep, penetrating watchfulness. He was Garrett Stone, though Jack did not know it yet. "That's a fine dog you have there," the man said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone. It was calm, steady, and carried an unmistakable air of authority. "He knows his job." "Who are you, and how did you get in my apartment?" Jack demanded, keeping his position in the doorway, Leo, a solid wall of growling muscle in front of him. "The name is Garrett Stone." "The lock was an amateur's work," the man said. not as a boast but as a simple statement of fact. I needed to talk to you, Mr. Sullivan. And I needed to be sure we weren't being watched. He nodded toward the window. You've had a tail for the last 24 hours. Black sedan. Amateurs as well. The confirmation of his fears sent a chill down Jack's spine. He slowly closed the door behind him, but didn't move any further into the room. What do you want? I heard someone claimed the Sea Serpent, Garrett said. That ship has been my business for a long time. I was on her during her final voyage in 1985. Jack's breath caught in his throat. A crew member. A survivor. Garrett's piercing eyes studied Jack, assessing him. I was a Navy SEAL. That ship wasn't a cargo hauler. She was a covert operations vessel. Now, you tell me what you found. Jack looked from the old soldier to his dog. Leo was still tense, but his growl had subsided to a low, warning grumble. He seemed to be waiting, taking his cues from Jack but also from the stranger's calm demeanor. Jack made a decision. He was in over his head, and this man, whatever his motives, was the first real lead he had. He walked to the kitchen table and picked up the captain's logbook. I found this, he said, placing it in front of Garrett. Garrett took the book, his weathered hand surprisingly gentle as he opened it. He read a few pages, his expression grim. Captain Miller, he murmured. A good man. He didn't deserve what happened. He looked back up at Jack. Is this all? The question hung in the air. This was the moment of truth. Jack reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the ornate brass key. He placed it on the table beside the logbook. The effect on Garrett was immediate. The old soldier's calm facade cracked. His eyes widened, and he leaned forward, staring at the key as if he were seeing a ghost. He reached out a slightly trembling hand and picked it up, his thumb stroking the atomic seal on its head. My God, he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion that spanned 4 decades. After all these years, he managed to hide it. What is it? Jack asked, his own voice barely a whisper. Garrett finally looked up, his blue eyes locking onto Jack's. It's the key to everything, he said. The man you read about in that log, the passenger, was Viktor Orlov. He was a brilliant physicist who was defecting from the Eastern Bloc. He wasn't carrying military secrets. He was carrying scientific data. Research so advanced it could have revolutionized energy production, medicine, everything. It could have ended the Cold War, not with a bang, but with a handshake. He held up the key. This was the key to his personal safe, where he kept the most critical parts of his work. What happened to him? To the crew? Jack pressed. Garrett's face hardened, the lines deepening. The mission was compromised, he said, his voice dropping, each word laced with old, cold anger. We were sold out. There was a traitor on the inside, someone in our own intelligence community who fed our position to the enemy. They ambushed us at sea. They took Orlov and his research, and they executed the crew. I only survived because I was on a dive, checking the hull when the attack happened. The pieces clicked into place, forming a picture of unimaginable betrayal. Jack looked at the key, no longer just a piece of brass but a symbol of a man's lost hope and a nation's treachery. Whoever is watching you, Garrett said, his voice grim. They know what this ship represents. They've been waiting for someone to stir up the past, and now, you have. The revelation hung heavy in the air of Jack's apartment, a suffocating shroud of treachery and death. Jack looked at Garrett, the old SEAL's face, a mask of bitter memories. Leo, sensing the gravity of the moment, lay quietly at Jack's feet, his gaze fixed on the 2 men. The simple act of claiming a derelict ship had plunged Jack into a decades-old conspiracy, far removed from the safe, mundane struggle for survival he had anticipated. Who was it? Jack finally asked, his voice low and tight. Who betrayed them? Garrett's jaw tightened. A ghost from my past, Mr. Sullivan. A man named Julian Thorne. He was our CIA handler, the liaison for the operation. He was charming, intelligent, and utterly ruthless. We trusted him with our lives. Garrett's eyes held a haunted look. He sold us out to the Soviets for a fortune. He covered it up so thoroughly, made it look like the Soviets simply outmaneuvered us. Everyone bought it. Everyone but me. But I had no proof. Just a gut feeling and the knowledge of what I saw. Just then, Jack's phone, which had been silent for days except for bill collectors, buzzed loudly on the table. He looked at the unknown number, a knot forming in his stomach. Garrett's eyes narrowed. "Don't answer it," Garrett warned, his voice sharp. But Jack, driven by a foolish mix of fear and defiance, ignored him. He picked up the phone. "Hello?" A voice, smooth and cultured, yet laced with an icy menace, spoke. "Mr. Sullivan, I presume? Or should I call you the sea serpent diver?" Jack's blood ran cold. The man knew his name, knew about the ship. "Who is this?" "My name is Julian Thorne," the voice purred. "A name that should mean something to your associate. I believe you have something that belongs to me. A certain piece of brass, perhaps? And a quaint little diary?" Jack glanced at Garrett, whose face had gone pale, his lips pressed into a thin, hard line. "I don't know what you're talking about," Jack tried to bluff, his voice wavering slightly. Thorne chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Don't insult my intelligence, Mr. Sullivan. I've been watching that ship, and anyone who gets too close to it, for 40 years. I watched you bring out that logbook. I watched your clever little dog find my old friend Orlov's key. Now, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. I suggest you meet me tomorrow, noon, at the old abandoned lighthouse on the northern end of Two Lights State Park. Come alone, or rather, just with the dog. Your associate is not invited. And if you involve anyone else, or if you don't show, you'll find out just how unpleasant I can be." The line went dead. Jack slowly lowered the phone, his hand trembling. The bluff had failed. Thorne was real, and he was hunting them. "Thorne?" Garrett finally said, his voice raspy. "He's still alive, still hunting." He reached for the brass key, turning it over in his fingers. "He wants this key, and whatever it unlocks is the final piece of Orlov's work. The piece he couldn't find, even after he ambushed the ship." "He said he was watching," Jack whispered, remembering the black sedan. "He said he knew about Leo finding the key." Garrett's eyes swept the apartment, a new urgency in his gaze. He had a team. He must have installed listening devices, tiny, state-of-the-art bugs. He's been listening to everything we've said, every discovery we've made. Jack felt a wave of nausea. Every conversation with Dr. Thorne, every word he'd spoken to Garrett, every frustrated sigh he'd uttered to Leo, had been overheard. They had been unwitting participants in Thorne's twisted game for days. "So he wants to meet me at the lighthouse," Jack said, his mind racing. "Alone. Just me and Leo." "It's a trap, son," Garrett stated flatly. "He'll take the key, and then he'll eliminate you. He's tied up too many loose ends over the years to let you walk away now. But if I don't go, he'll come for us anyway." "He knows where I live," Jack countered, gesturing vaguely around the small apartment. "And he knows where the ship is." He thought of Leo, innocent and loyal, his safety now inextricably linked to this deadly secret. "We need more than just the key," Jack said, his gaze fixed on the ornate piece of brass. "Thorne said this key unlocks Orlov's personal safe. There must be other things in there, things that prove what happened, things that expose Thorne." Garrett nodded slowly. "You're right. He never found the key, which means he never got to Orlov's personal belongings. He was after the scientific data, but Orlov was a meticulous man. He would have left a paper trail, something for his family, a final testament." "Where is this safe?" Jack asked. Garrett closed his eyes, concentrating. Orlov was a cautious man. He spoke of having a secure place for his personal effects, something only he could access. A small, hidden compartment built into his cabin, but it was well hidden. "We never found it after the attack. The Soviets ransacked the place." He opened his eyes. "The sea serpent. It has to be on the ship. The key is to his personal belongings, not the main scientific vault." The logbook mentioned a reinforced hold for the main cargo." Jack grabbed his jacket and the brass key. "Then we need to get back to the ship before Thorne's people sweep it clean." Garrett held up a hand. "Wait. Thorne knows we've found the key, and he knows we now know he's been listening. He'll anticipate us going back to the ship. He'll have it staked out. Then we have to be smarter," Jack said, a flicker of his old combat cunning returning. "He wants me at the lighthouse tomorrow. That buys us time tonight. He'll be watching for us, leaving for the lighthouse, or trying to contact authorities. He won't expect us to go back to the ship, not after the call." Garrett looked at Jack, a glint of respect in his tired eyes. "A good strategy, son. The element of surprise. We use his arrogance against him. But first," Jack said, looking down at Leo, who was watching them intently, "we need to check something else." Jack led Garrett to the kitchen table. He retrieved the small, heavily varnished wooden box that had contained the captain's logbook when Leo first found it. He knew it was too small to be Orlov's personal safe, but it was where the key was hidden. Garrett watched as Jack opened the small box again. He ran his fingers along the inside, feeling for any loose panels. Leo, sensing their renewed focus, put his nose into the box, sniffing. Suddenly, Leo let out a soft boof and nudged a corner of the box with his nose. Jack felt it then. A tiny, almost imperceptible protrusion. He pressed it, and a tiny, almost invisible panel slid open. Inside was a micro-thin, almost transparent square of plastic. It was a miniature GPS tracker, no larger than a fingernail. It was cold to the touch, and a tiny, almost invisible red light pulsed rhythmically. "He's been tracking us," Jack said, his voice tight with anger. "This thing must have been activated when we opened the box the first time. He knew exactly when we found the key. He knew where we were all along." Garrett's face hardened further. The Cold War never ended for men like Thorne. It just went underground. He's been playing this game for decades. Now we play it with him. Night fell over Portland like a black shroud, swallowing the harbor in an inky darkness broken only by the distant, lonely lights of the city. Under the cover of a moonless sky, Jack, Garrett, and Leo moved through the shadows with the practiced silence of ghosts. Garrett, despite his age, moved with an unnerving stealth, a testament to his SEAL training. Jack fell back into the familiar rhythms of a nighttime patrol, his senses heightened, his movements economical and precise. Leo was in his element, a silver-gray shadow gliding at Jack's side, his ears constantly swiveling, his nose testing the air for any hint of danger. They reached the Sea Serpent without incident. The black sedan was gone, but both men knew that didn't mean they weren't being watched. They boarded the ship, their soft-soled boots making no sound on the damp gangway. The vessel felt different at night, more alive, its groans and creaks like the sighs of a restless spirit. Orlov's cabin was on the second deck of the superstructure, port side, Garrett whispered, his voice a low rasp in the stillness. He valued his privacy and his security. He led the way through the labyrinthine corridors, his memory of the ship's layout seemingly unaffected by the passage of 4 decades. They reached a cabin door, its paint peeling, the small brass number plate, long since corroded into illegibility. The lock was broken, the door hanging slightly ajar. The scene inside was one of frozen violence. The cabin had been utterly ransacked. The mattress was slashed, drawers were pulled out and overturned, and papers were scattered across the floor like dead leaves. It was exactly as Garrett had described. The Soviets had torn the room apart looking for Orlov's secrets. They were thorough, Jack observed, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. If there's a safe in here, they would have found it. Not necessarily, Garrett countered. Orlov was brilliant. He once told me he believed the best hiding place was the one everyone sees, but no one notices. Garrett's eyes scanned the room, looking past the chaos, searching for a hint of order, a piece of meticulous design in the midst of destruction. His gaze settled on a small, built-in bookshelf. Unlike everything else, it seemed largely intact, its wood dark and heavy. He ran his hands along the inside of the bookshelf, pressing, tapping, feeling for a hollow space. He paused, his fingers tracing the ornate carving on a decorative wooden panel at the back. He was a craftsman in his spare time, Garrett murmured. He loved working with wood. He pressed a specific point in the carving, and with a soft, satisfying click, the entire back panel of the bookshelf swung inward, revealing a dark, square cavity. Set inside was a heavy, steel strongbox, its surface clean and untouched by the decay that had claimed the rest of the cabin. In its center was a single, ornate lock, a perfect match for the brass key Jack held in his hand. With his heart pounding, Jack stepped forward. He inserted the key into the lock. It slid in smoothly. A perfect fit. He turned it. For a moment there was resistance, 40 years of disuse fighting back. Then, with a solid, resonant clunk, the mechanism released. Jack lifted the heavy lid. The air that escaped smelled of old paper, leather, and something faintly floral, like dried lavender. Inside, resting on a bed of faded velvet, were the carefully preserved remnants of Victor Orlov's life. There was a small, hand-carved wooden bird, a faded photograph of a beautiful woman holding a little girl with bright dark eyes, and a stack of letters tied with a simple ribbon. And on top of it all lay a thick, sealed envelope. In elegant, handwritten English were the words, "For Anja." Garrett looked over Jack's shoulder, his breath catching in his throat. "Anja," he said softly, "his daughter." He talked about her all the time. Jack carefully broke the seal and unfolded the letter within. It was dated October 1985, written just days before the ship went silent. He began to read aloud, his voice low and steady in the darkness. "My dearest Anja," the letter began. "If you are reading this, it means I have failed. It means the world has been denied a great gift, and you have been denied your father. Know this, my love. I was never a traitor. I was a man who saw a future of limitless, clean energy, of medicine that could cure the incurable, and I could not allow that future to be weaponized by men who only understood power and fear." The letter went on to detail the nature of his research, not as a weapon, but as a promise for all mankind. Then, the tone shifted, growing colder, harder. "But there are always men who profit from fear. I was betrayed by the very man assigned to ensure my safety, an American agent named Julian Thorne. He sold my life, the lives of a brave crew, and the hope for a better world for Soviet gold. He is a man with a hollow soul, and he will do anything to keep this truth buried." Jack paused, the name hanging in the air like a death sentence. He continued reading. "He believes he has won. He took my primary research, but he did not get everything. My most vital work, the core equations and the key to the entire project, are secured elsewhere on this vessel. They are in the main cargo vault, hidden behind the primary engine's cooling manifold. He will never find it. The access code is a sequence only a father would know, a prayer I have whispered every night since I left you." Jack took a deep breath before reading the final lines. "The code is your full name and your birth date. Anja Viktorovna Orlova, the 5th of April, 1978. It is my final legacy, my love letter to you and to the future. Use it wisely. Know that your father loved you more than the stars in the sky." The letter ended there. Silence descended on the small, ruined cabin. Jack looked at the photograph of the little girl, her bright eyes staring back at him across an ocean of time. He was a father. He understood the desperate, all-consuming need to protect one's child, to leave them a legacy of love, even in the face of death. Garrett stood motionless, his face etched with a profound sorrow. "He left her a key to save the world," he said, his voice thick with emotion. They now had it all. The proof of Thorne's betrayal, the location of the real prize, and the code to unlock it. The meeting at the lighthouse was no longer an option. It was a distraction. Their true mission was now clear. They had to get to that vault. For Victor, for the crew of the Sea Serpent, and for a little girl named Anja. The discovery of Orlov's letter, a father's last words, and a blueprint for hope, ignited a new fire in Jack. The desolate cabin, moments ago a testament to a personal tragedy, now pulsed with a frantic urgency. The code was clear. Anja Viktorovna Orlova, the 5th of April, 1978. The main cargo vault, hidden behind the primary engine's cooling manifold. "We need to move," Jack whispered, his voice sharp with determination. "Thorne thinks I'll be at the lighthouse tomorrow. That means he has tonight to sweep this ship. He'll send his people." Garrett nodded, his usually calm demeanor replaced by a steely focus. "He'll send a team to secure the ship and search for anything we might have missed. He's been waiting 40 years. He won't take chances now." They slipped out of Orlov's cabin, closing the secret compartment and replacing the bookshelf panel. Leo, sensing the heightened tension, moved with a silent, predatory grace, his senses on full alert. They navigated the dark, labyrinthine corridors, guided by Garrett's memory and Jack's flashlight. Every creak of the ship, every whisper of the wind through broken portholes seemed to amplify the sense of impending danger. The engine room of the Sea Serpent was a cavernous, intimidating space. Even in its derelict state, the skeletal remains of the massive diesel engines loomed like metallic beasts, their rusted pipes and gauges a monument to a bygone era of power. The air here was heavy with the metallic tang of old oil, brine, and the oppressive silence of a machine that had not roared to life in decades. The cooling manifold, Garrett pointed, with his flashlight beam, indicating a complex network of massive pipes and valves running along the side of the largest engine. He said, "Behind it," which means it's not easily visible. As they moved deeper into the engine room, the silence was abruptly broken. Leo, who had been padding silently by Jack's side, suddenly stopped dead. His ears swiveled, listening intently to something Jack couldn't hear. Then a low, guttural growl rumbled in his chest, a sound that sent a chill down Jack's spine. Leo's head whipped around, his eyes fixed on a dark corner near a stack of rusted spare parts. "What is it, boy?" Jack whispered, his hand instinctively going to Leo's head. Leo didn't respond with a bark, but with a series of quick, sharp nudges of his nose towards the corner. Jack shone his flashlight in the direction Leo indicated. He saw nothing but shadows and rust. He took a cautious step forward, Leo pressing tightly against his leg. "Wait," Garrett hissed, his voice barely audible. He knelt down, his eyes scanning the floor. "There," he pointed. Jack lowered his beam. Barely visible on the grimy, oil-stained metal floor was a faint, almost imperceptible scuff mark. It was too fresh to be 40 years old. Someone had been here. Recently. Very recently. And then Leo let out another low growl, this time directing his attention to a large support beam. Jack slowly moved his flashlight up the beam, following Leo's intense gaze. His heart sank. Just above eye level, cleverly camouflaged against the rust-streaked metal, was a tiny, almost invisible metallic disc. It was a modern listening device, far more sophisticated than the crude one they'd found in the wooden box. "They're here," Jack breathed, his voice tight. "Or they've been here, and they're listening right now." Garrett's face was grim. Thorne wasted no time. He anticipated we'd come back to the ship tonight. We're on borrowed time. They moved with renewed urgency, a desperate race against unseen ears and approaching footsteps. They began to systematically examine the massive cooling manifold. The pipes were thick, encrusted with layers of dried salt and paint. They tapped, pushed, and pulled, searching for any seam, any weakness, any sign of a hidden compartment. Leo continued to be their silent sentinel, his ears constantly scanning their surroundings. At one point, he let out a quick woof and nudged Jack's leg urgently, pulling him away from a section of pipes that looked promising. Jack followed Leo's lead, moving further along the manifold. "Here," Garrett finally announced, his voice strained. He was wedged between two enormous pipes, his hands working at a section of the manifold that seemed slightly out of place. He pointed to a faint outline, barely visible beneath layers of paint and grime. It was a subtle seam, a rectangular outline about 4 feet high and 3 feet wide. Someone had gone to great lengths to conceal it. Jack retrieved his crowbar, his muscles screaming in protest from the cramped position. He worked at the seam, the metal groaning in protest. With each strained heave, the air grew heavier, thick with anticipation and the growing certainty that they were being hunted. Suddenly, Leo let out a series of frantic barks, a sharp, urgent warning that echoed through the vast engine room. His head was turned towards the main entrance of the engine room, his body tensed, his hackles raised. "Footsteps," Garrett whispered, his face pale. "Coming down the ladder. Multiple. They're here." Jack pushed harder, his adrenaline surging. He could hear it now, too, the distant metallic clang of boots on the access ladder, growing louder with terrifying speed. There was no time left. "Anja Viktorovna Orlova, the 5th of April, 1978, Jack muttered, repeating the code under his breath, desperately trying to remember the sequence. He located the numeric keypad, a small, modern-looking panel, seamlessly integrated into the hidden door. Orlov must have installed it, anticipating a future where such technology would be common. His fingers flew across the keypad, entering the numbers. AEK 1, NEEK 14, JEEK 10, AEK 1. He converted the full name to a numerical sequence, then typed in the birth date, 0504-1978. Just as the first shadowy figures appeared at the main entrance to the engine room, flashlights cutting through the darkness, a soft electronic whir emanated from the hidden door. Then, with a deep hydraulic hiss, the heavy steel door began to slide open, revealing a brilliantly lit, pristine chamber within. It was a stark contrast to the decay and darkness of the engine room. Jack and Garrett scrambled inside, Leo darting between their legs. The heavy door began to slide shut behind them, just as the first shouts of Thorne's men echoed through the engine room. They had made it, just barely. The heavy vault door hissed shut, encasing them in a world of sterile light and profound silence. Outside, the muffled shouts of Thorne's men and the clang of metal against metal were a terrifying yet distant reality. The vault was a time capsule. Racks of microfilm canisters, binders filled with meticulous notes, and diagrams of complex molecular structures lined the walls. This was Viktor Orlov's legacy, the life's work he had died to protect. "We don't have time," Garrett said, his voice echoing in the small space. He pointed to a single, reinforced briefcase on a central table. "That will be it. The core data." Orlov was methodical. He'd have a summary package. Jack grabbed the heavy briefcase. At the back of the vault, his flashlight beam caught the outline of a small, circular hatch marked with a stenciled warning, "Emergency access." "Orlov's escape plan," Garrett breathed, a look of grim admiration on his face. He thought of everything. They worked the heavy locking wheel, the mechanism stiff but functional. It opened into a narrow, dark tube, a service tunnel barely wide enough for one person at a time. It smelled of stale air and cold steel. "Leo, go," Jack commanded quietly. The dog didn't hesitate, slipping into the darkness like a shadow. Jack followed, the briefcase clutched in one hand, his other hand on the cold rungs of a service ladder. Garrett came last, sealing the hatch behind them. They were plunged into absolute blackness, the only sounds their own breathing and the frantic pounding of their hearts. The tunnel was claustrophobic, a tight metal intestine that seemed to stretch on forever. It led them downwards, towards the rhythmic sound of lapping water. They emerged through a maintenance hatch onto a narrow, corroded ledge that ran along the ship's hull, just a few feet above the dark, swirling water of the harbor. They were hidden from the main dock by the immense, curving side of the Sea Serpent. For a moment, they were safe, but they were also trapped. Above them, they could hear the sounds of Thorne's men searching the ship, their powerful flashlights cutting beams through the night. "We're sitting ducks here," Jack said, his eyes scanning the harbor. In the distance, he saw the slow, steady sweep of a searchlight. A Coast Guard patrol boat, making its routine rounds. It was their only chance. Garrett unzipped his jacket and pulled out a small, compact flare gun he had retrieved from an emergency locker on their way to the engine room. "One shot," he said, loading a single red flare cartridge. "Let's make it count." He aimed it high into the night sky, away from the ship, and pulled the trigger. With a loud whoosh, the flare shot upwards, a brilliant crimson star that blossomed against the black canvas of the sky. It cast a bloody, apocalyptic glow over the harbor, painting the rusted hull of the Sea Serpent in demonic light. Hundreds of miles away, in a quiet, sterile monitoring room in a government building near Washington, D.C., the frantic call came in. An analyst, a young man with wide, nervous eyes, turned from his screen. "Ma'am, we have a priority alert," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "The assets we've been monitoring, the ones linked to Julian Thorne, are converging on a single location, a cargo vessel in Portland Harbor, Maine." Anja Orlov stood from her desk, her movements sharp and decisive. At 45, she was a woman of formidable presence. She had her father's intelligent, dark eyes, but hers held a fire, a relentless intensity forged over 2 decades of navigating the treacherous corridors of power. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe, professional style, and her tailored suit did little to hide the disciplined strength of her frame. For years, her official role at the State Department had been a cover for her real, obsessive mission: to unravel the truth of Operation Sea Serpent and find the man who had betrayed her father, Julian Thorne. "He's making his move," she said, her voice a low, controlled hum of energy. She strode to the main screen, which now showed a satellite image of the harbor, a single derelict ship circled in red, the Sea Serpent. "He knows someone has found my father's work. He's not trying to hide anymore. He's trying to erase the evidence." She turned to the communications officer. "Get me a secure line to the commander of Coast Guard Sector, Northern New England. Now, authorize a rapid response team, federal jurisdiction. Tell them they have a confirmed national security threat and potential hostages on board that vessel. I want a lockdown on that entire harbor. No one gets in or out." Her orders were a cascade of precise, rapid-fire commands, the culmination of a lifetime of preparation. She had spent years building this case, placing Thorne under a quiet, digital surveillance he had never detected. She had been waiting for him to make a mistake, to finally move on the prize he had been denied for 40 years. Now he had, and she was ready. The crimson light of the flare began to fade, plunging them back into darkness, but it had done its job. The distant searchlight of the Coast Guard boat froze, then swung directly toward them. The boat changed course, its engines revving as it headed their way. Hope surged through Jack, but it was short-lived. The flare had also alerted Thorne's men. Shouts erupted from the deck above. Powerful flashlight beams stabbed down at the water, searching for them. "They've seen us," Garrett yelled over the wind. The Coast Guard boat was close now, its blue lights flashing, its horn blaring a warning. But just as it prepared to approach the Sea Serpent, a second, faster vessel roared out of the darkness. It was a sleek, black tactical boat, cutting through the water with military precision. It positioned itself between the Coast Guard and the cargo ship, blocking their path. The confrontation was about to turn ugly. But then, a third voice joined the fray, the powerful, amplified voice of a woman, echoing across the water from the tactical boat. "This is a federal operation," the voice boomed, sharp and clear with absolute authority. "U.S. Coast Guard, stand down and await my command. All personnel on board the Sea Serpent, drop your weapons and surrender immediately. You are surrounded." A figure emerged on the bow of the tactical boat, illuminated by the Coast Guard's searchlight. It was a woman in a dark professional suit, her face set with a look of grim determination. Anja Orlov had arrived. Her appearance, backed by a team of armed federal agents, was a shocking, decisive move that Thorne could never have anticipated. His carefully laid plan, 40 years in the making, had just been shattered. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Jack felt like he could breathe. The cavalry had arrived, and she had her father's eyes. The aftermath of the confrontation was a controlled storm of flashing blue lights, crackling radios, and the quiet, efficient movements of federal agents. Thorne's men were taken into custody, their faces a mixture of shock and disbelief. The briefcase containing Viktor Orlov's legacy was secured by Anja's team, its contents destined to rewrite a dark chapter of Cold War history. In the midst of the organized chaos, Jack, Garrett, and Leo were guided onto a Coast Guard cutter. Anja approached them as the boat pulled away from the looming shadow of the sea serpent. She looked at the briefcase, then at Jack, her professional composure softening for the first time, revealing the daughter who had finally found her father. "You and your dog," she said, her voice filled with a quiet awe. "You found what my government, with all its resources, couldn't find for 40 years. You gave him a voice." There were no other words needed. A silent understanding passed between them, a shared acknowledgement of a debt that could never truly be repaid. 6 months later, spring had arrived in Portland, breathing new life into the city. A warm, gentle sun shone down from a brilliant blue sky, a stark contrast to the relentless gray drizzle that had mirrored Jack's life just a short time ago. The truth about Operation Sea Serpent had been made public. Julian Thorne, facing a mountain of undeniable evidence, was convicted of treason and would spend the rest of his life in a federal prison. Viktor Orlov was posthumously hailed as a global hero, a man whose sacrifice had pulled the world back from the brink of nuclear annihilation. The Sea Serpent no longer slept in the forgotten corner of the harbor. She now occupied a place of honor at the main pier, a proud and beautiful monument to the truth. Gone were the weeping trails of rust and the aura of decay. Her hull was painted a deep, dignified navy blue, her superstructure a gleaming white. Her decks, once littered with debris, were now polished and clean. A bronze plaque was mounted near the newly restored gangway. It read, "The Sea Serpent, in memory of Viktor Orlov and the brave crew who chose humanity over conflict. May their sacrifice remind us that the greatest treasures are not secrets, but the truths we share." 1985. The ship had been transformed into a museum, a floating classroom dedicated to a pivotal, secret moment in history. And its curator was Jack Sullivan. He stood on the main deck, watching a group of schoolchildren listen intently as a tour guide explained the significance of the captain's logbook, now a centerpiece exhibit. Jack was a different man. The haunted, weary look in his eyes had been replaced by a quiet, steady peace. The lines on his face seemed softer, etched now by purpose rather than pain. His construction skills had been invaluable in the ship's restoration, a project funded by a grateful government. He had poured his heart into rebuilding the vessel, finding a profound, healing satisfaction in transforming a place of death into a beacon of hope. Leo lay basking in a patch of sunlight near the main mast, his silver-gray coat shining. His days of tense vigilance were over. He was the museum's official mascot and unofficial therapy dog, adored by staff and visitors alike. He would often greet tour groups with a friendly wag of his tail, accepting gentle pats from children and leaning his head reassuringly against the legs of fellow veterans who came to pay their respects. He was still Jack's shadow, but his world was no longer a battlefield. It was a place of peace, filled with gentle hands and kind words. The substantial reward money Jack had received for recovering Orlov's research had been put to good use. He had established the Leo Sullivan Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to supporting veterans suffering from PTSD and funding the adoption and care of retired military working dogs. His own journey from the brink had given him a new mission to ensure that other soldiers, both human and canine, found their way back from the darkness. As the last of the day's visitors departed, a quiet calm settled over the ship. Jack walked over to Leo, kneeling down to scratch the dog behind his ears. Leo let out a soft groan of contentment, leaning his full weight against Jack. "Well, boy," Jack murmured, looking out at the harbor as the setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and gold. Who would have thought? He thought back to the desperate, broken man he had been, a man who saw this ship as nothing more than a pile of scrap metal, a final, hopeless gamble. He had been searching for a way to survive, and instead, he had found a reason to live. He had faced down ghosts from the past, both his own and the ship's, and had emerged into a new dawn. Anja and Garrett were now his closest friends, a strange, beautiful family forged in a 40-year-old secret. They were all part of the ship's story, and the ship was now a part of them. Jack stood up, his hand resting on Leo's back. They stood together on the deck, man and dog, two old soldiers who had finally found their way home. The ghosts of the sea serpent were at peace, their story finally told. And for Jack Sullivan, the long internal war was finally over. He was no longer adrift in a sea of despair. He was the keeper of a legacy, a builder of hope, and the grateful human companion to a very, very good dog. The greatest treasures are rarely made of gold. They are forged in the quiet moments of unwavering loyalty, proving that even after the deepest loss, hope can be discovered in the most unexpected of places. If the story of Jack and Leo's unbreakable bond touched your heart, we invite you to share it with someone you know who understands that kind of love. Your support in any form, from a simple like to subscribing to our channel, helps us continue our mission. Our next story is ready to begin. Just a single click away on the video now on your screen.